readings on urban economics section, blending into the arts. The a big theme that I pointed out in the last two or three sections, but mostly stressed Monday, our last lecture, is where and how we have conflicts among alternative perspectives, and where and how can, in the whole course, we deal with development, which is a little more general term. If we mean what more specifically, it's mostly economic development, but in a sense, economic development is now being redefined more broadly, including by, first of all, by economists talking about amenities. And amenities was a concept stressed by several people, but such as Edward Glaser, and his long paper on this, and which we then have taken over that in the scenescapes analysis. But it's not just individual amenities, but one of the steps ahead is to combine hundreds of amenities, and that makes a scene, not just one movie house, not just one cafe, dozens of them, and where and how they combine into a more holistic scene, and where and how these things add the way people feel and act about it. Can you move this a little bit so you're not so loud? Okay, thank you. One example of this is the paper, part of a book by Sharon Sukin, Philip Klasniks, and Xingmai Chen, called Global Cities, Local Streets, Everyday Diversity from New York to Shanghai. This was a presentation by them at the same time that we had sections of what we were presenting here in Chicago at an American Sociological Association meeting. And I mention this because her name, she added a couple of things. Her background, she says in her website, is I am a Marxist. But she also, among others who were creative Marxists, began to see other things that were not the normal Marxist interpretations and components. So she did a book on loft living, that is, people who live and this was she mostly has done ethnographic work, not really comparative quantitative work, and she saw these lofts, which were abandoned, often industrial buildings, which were then taken over by artists nearby Wall Street in the south end of New York, Manhattan. And so she pointed this out, that this was an interesting, more general point, not just the price or the distance, which were the simpler economic, geographic, sociological, traditional factors to look at, but then to think about where and why an artist might want to be in an attractive area to have more space for paintings, but also for having parties or shows or dances, and where more space became an attractive feature as well. And that illustrated going further. She then wrote some other papers on individual neighborhoods or two streets where she focus on such things as wedding dresses, which are not the normal topics. So Gary Becker could have written a paper about it. Ed Glaser easily could add that. But the point is, she would then write about what kinds of shops were also on the same street together. That if you're getting a wedding dress, maybe you're going to get also flowers, or you're going to get shoes that might go with those. And we're doing the same there. On the other hand, when she then began to look more generally around the world, which is this book, which we have here, she included a co-author from Shanghai and New York, and a little bit from Europe. And so she made the general point that we're having a theme which one could trace most directly, if you want to keep our Marxist theme explicit, Lenin. Lenin talked about global capitalism more than did Marx, and in that way, the idea that there's global capitalism making the world the same all around the world is a pseudo-Marxist kind of idea. The commodification is a related term. That if you make things more standardized, then we can produce commodified products like wedding dresses that could be sold in 1,000 different cities, not just in New York. And in that way, that kind of linkage is the theme which they then tried to show empirically. But how did they show it? They had 3 people who chose 3 streets. We don't know how she or they chose those 3 streets. Are they representative of something or what? And then beyond that, which shops do you include on that street? And so basically, what they say in the book was, we're getting a commodified global capitalist structure. She didn't highlight these kinds of the Marxist themes very explicitly, on the contrary. But in fact, that's the informed underlying foundation, if you will. So, by contrast, the next reading, and what we point out more, and I'll mention that Gordon C.C. Douglas, who was a teaching assistant in this class in the past, he really stressed not that there's global capitalism driving this. What the title is, and he did a book on this as well, this is just a short paper overview, Do It Yourself Urban Design. Do it yourself, bottom up. One person alone can make, for example, if you live in a street where there's water and it's flooding out, and the drains are not working properly, and so people will really get your shoes wet badly if you got water like this. And so what he said is, do it yourself. So you can call the city, you can do a form, you can say, please, City of Chicago, please put a piece of wood there, or fix the drains. I mean, we've got flooding on our street, and nothing happens. This happens all around the world. So his answer, and this is he's not unique, but he's now articulating this, is do it yourself. Get a piece of wood. Get some of your friends and maybe hammer something down, add a little bit down, and so he then has a whole book on how this is happening, how people are doing it, where we can enhance it, how we can think about it. We can talk about innovativeness, buzz, not just fight the bureaucracy, not just say capitalism is flooding on my street. Fix it yourself. Okay, so these are 2 readings to show different ways that you can handle similar challenges. All right, I can go on with one more if you want to present your stuff. You can.
Because I don't prepare I don't prepare my work or materials.
Okay. Okay. So I'll continue then.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Let me then take a next interesting kind of step, in the sense that a theme in the Sharon Zucken example, and then the next sections, which we'll talk about, one section, so in terms of the section on separate section on the syllabus, but which we've been talking about through the whole course. One of the things from the beginning is we have a rise of consumption of arts aesthetics and where and how these have been transforming the meanings of development and economic development in a more explicit and subtle and holistic sort of way. But we then remember these things, including the arts, and I'm going to give you an example here, which is not just, quote, positive or negative in the normal moralistic ethical sense, but what's good and what's bad for economic development, what's good and what's bad for most people about it. But where and how do we have things like noise, rain, bad weather, good weather, and how about security, also called crime? So we talked about the book Freakonomics, and we said, you know, the author is full professor here, economics department. What defines Freakonomics? And the thing which was most dramatic was, and he'd been studying crime for years, was to focus on a surprising source of crime. Okay, another way to look at this is to bike around Chicago, take a look at different streets, imagine where there may be more crime or not, and then talk to people, think about it. And there was a new assistant professor a couple of years ago named Forrest Stewart, came here from UCLA, and we rode around Chicago a fair amount. I said, you know, this is great stuff. Let's keep talking. And so he, as I listened, I heard him say, you know, material things may be loosely Marxist, maybe not, more indirectly through William Julius Wilson, I mentioned last time, very smart African-American sociologist. And Bill Wilson, as I mentioned in his first books, most of his books were stressing jobs, factories, unions, where people live with their work nearby with those, and how that led to the decline of some neighborhoods, especially African-American neighborhoods. And then I pointed out that he was appointed by Barack Obama to lead the urban section when he was in transition, when the transition from as with Trump right now, that sort of period after the election and before the installation. Bill Wilson then said, hey, African Americans are not just oppressed at the bottom. We've got the presidency. He's an African American. Let's think, are there things we can now be more ambitious than just complain? Or say the system is pressing us down. And so he said, how can we deal with things like the black family, or gender differences, or crime? And he started, and then he had published a book about this, and he basically said, I'm changing my perspective in a serious way, away from this more materialist kind of narrow historical materialist kind of definition, but to say, maybe things we should use the concept and the term culture, and say culture is not to be ignored or seen as a superstructure, as Marx might have talked about it, and instead, let's think about what are some of the sources of crime or not crime, or how we have other institutions like the family, which are not just jobs. And so he broadened his perspective. So this, if you will, comes from an African American, relatively lower status kind of perspective, which he mostly wrote about. Most of his books also focused not on all African Americans. He focused mostly on the poorest of the poor, often below the official government poverty level, and certainly below middle class. And so he then said, let's look at all of these, and now they're interrelated a little bit more. Okay, especially as you have a president. So in that way, Forrest Stewart had just come here as assistant professor. We're biking along and said, hey, you know, Bill Wilson has a new book. It's got really some interesting new ideas. You know about that? What's the book? No, he'd never heard of it. So I said, hey, talk about culture, innovation, cities, neighborhoods, amenities. He said, what's that all about? So we started talking about that. And then we said, well, now look. And so what he'd worked on before was gangs, African American gangs, and how they transport. And this is a nice. In his earlier work, he started field work in one of the toughest, difficult, homeless neighborhoods. So homeless used to be the term. Now people talk about illegal immigrants, but it's this. And these are homeless, as often living in tents these days, etc. And where and how this might be changed for and at least to try to interpret it, to understand it better. For that, let's play a little bit from what he has to say. The arts.
Here's the fundamental change that we've seen in terms of putting policing on the national radar has to be digital social media. We've seen this massive democratization in terms of communication technology. Some recent statistics have actually come out from here, from the University of Chicago, that actually shows that Black youth are some of the most prolific users of social media. They're also the social group, racial group that is uploading original content and modifying content online at the highest rate, sometimes two times the rate that white kids are. And so I think that when you combine that with the fact that there are certain issues that are affecting the Black community in America, when you combine those two, I think it's kind of a no-brainer, it's kind of natural that we're going to see a kind of explosion of lived reality. While I was doing my work on Skid Row, I think one of the major things that I realized was that poor urban residents and the police essentially were suffering to a certain extent from the same exact policies that have been handed down over the last few decades, right? So we've seen a real hollowing out of the welfare state, we've seen this amplification of policing, and this call by cities to use police to solve a whole host of problems that we never used to necessarily see as policing issues. Things like mental illness, things like addiction, things like homelessness, things like general disorder, poverty in general. I think that one of the things that my research has really shown is that how things are moving.
Okay, so that's his past, but he's saying it didn't work that well. His new book is what is interesting. Growing out of our biking around Chicago, that his past work was in LA, and it had, I'll just add one interesting theme as well, just in terms of historical policy specifics. Another intervention was James Q. Wilson, Harvard, Chicago professor, talked about the broken windows theory. And this came from James Wilson, who said, if we've got lots of broken windows in the area, that sort of defines it as a bad neighborhood. And so instead of letting these broken windows stay that way, we want to keep them, we want to fix the windows or tear down the whole house, but somehow don't have broken windows defining that the neighborhood is bad. Okay, that idea got picked up by the Boston police chief. He did it and crime went down in Boston. Hey, New York hired him. So he then became the chief of police at New York. Crime went down. Hey, a couple of years later, Los Angeles hired him away. Hey, crime went down in Los Angeles. So he then started doing op-ed pieces in the New York Times and so forth saying, hey, this is how we can solve the crime problem. Broken windows theory. All right. So we then have something which is more holistic, that is not just being one person who may be poor and who steals because he's poor and he wants more money and he's hungry. I mean, that would be a crude, simplistic, materialist interpretation. So then, going beyond that, so Forrest began to say, how do the gangs work on this? Or how do people who are tough, if you want to, somehow deal with crime, maybe there's a different way of talking about this stuff. And he noticed, by the way, that the gangs were fighting each other, not only in the street or talking about it, they started doing it, and you heard him say here, online. The media, social media, not the mass media, and using certain kinds of music, rap, driller rap, okay, drillers, okay, so then we then get to these bringing in of the media, aesthetics, the arts, music, but at the same time featuring macho toughness and is this generating higher crime, or is it a perception of higher crime? Which is more important? Both are important, but at least if you learn in this course, perception and fear in talking about crime is not the same thing as actual crime rates. And so Forrest and others have pointed this out, but his newer book is called The Ballad of the Bullet. Let's talk, just to show it a little bit on the Ballad of the Bullet and how this pulls some of these pieces together. With the rise of the arts, low income, security. Okay, so this is just a shot. We'll just leave it in the background if you want. Let it sit there. Showing this is not just in Chicago. This was in Canada, and these were not African Americans. These were young Asians, and some guys from internationally, not just African Americans, and they started doing violent rap lyrics, escalate gang tensions. That's the big headline, and I think, okay. So see that, but then and then as people then began to write about this, this is all around the world, not everywhere and not exactly the same thing. But the point is, we are getting social media and presenting and discussing these things in ways that were new, very new. Okay, and this fits with the course. Ballad of the Bullet. Okay, then we have, there's a little section where he talks about it. It's it was right, and what I sent to you is right at the beginning, is the video web address.
Yeah, this video is not available on YouTube, so I'm not sure.
Oh, it didn't work?
Yeah, it didn't work. So I'm just found a new one, but
I see. So this.
And also send you this.
I think I'm trying to see what that says. Well, okay, I see that there was what I had was a section, and if this one doesn't work, the point is driller rap or drill rap. Look it up yourself if you want. If you're not familiar from your own neighborhood and your own personal friends, just look a little bit at the term drill rap, and you can see gangs in Chicago or gangs in Vancouver or gangs in Russia, and they're not just black, and they may be threatening how you may be shot. And so then, is a little bit more, anything more from Forrest himself and his words, or maybe not? If those are the only two clips. Okay. Well, I'll give you the quick story. Was that Forrest would then got to know some of the gangs in some depth. And he would do, he did this, he was basically an ethnographer. So he got to know these guys, and he would drive them, for example, that is, who made the videos? The gang members themselves, or individuals, maybe not just gangs, but individuals will have, and that is, and I've had many other students who are doing sort of field work and some around Chicago, and they say, hey, just south of here, I mean, I go in there with a camera, and I'm in South Shore. I'm just a little bit other neighborhoods that have the highest crime rate, and every young sort of teenage black guy comes up to me and says, hey, you got a nice camera. Can you take some pictures of me right now? I'll show you my driller rap. And so sometimes he's once or twice he did that, or they say, I'll do it for you. But then once they've got the video, do they know how to edit it and how to make it fancier and look nicer and to bring in music or to bring in a background? That's a different kind of expertise. So he said, there are people who do that, who will help you out, who are sympathetic. So he would drive some of these gang members up to near the Wisconsin border, over an hour, 2 hours, to drive up there. And there's an affluent young white editor who's got lots of editing. He wouldn't want to live, he'd be afraid to live in a poor black neighborhood, but he can edit this stuff. And he can really talk about the ballad of the bullet could be online, and it could make people excited and scared. I can do that for you. And another guy was doing this, a German did it in Germany. You're in Chicago, that's okay, just send me your video. I'll edit it for you and send it back, and you can put it on the internet. So these were quite, engaged participants creating the ballad of the bullet. But a follow-up was, how many of these guys were actually shooting or killing anybody? And he has some. He didn't have any kind of serious statistical number, but the point was it was very high. That is, lots of guys gave the impression, that they were shooting all the time or they were killing people. But his answer was the number was a very small proportion of those guys were doing any crime at all, etc. Maybe I'll leave it at that, to simply say, can you see in this example of the arts, social media, the transformation of even the fear, that is, fear of crime comes from people seeing these videos substantially, and they about Chicago gangs, and you saw the example of the press coverage internationally. Chicago gets, and Forrest Stewart then gets the credit for saying, hey, this is Chicago sociology stuff. Okay, it is. Is it economics as well? Yes. The same stuff by the Freakonomics folks are writing about these same things, and they're citing often our graduate students in sociology who work and do field work with the gangs. Most of our economists don't do that, but they use the field work, such as this. And they put the stuff together, just as the editors of the videos in Germany don't write books about it and so forth, but they're part of the story. And that story, when you hear it, as I'm telling it to you here, keep these separate in your mind and don't see or interpret things which exaggerate, which is being done deliberately by the people who want to give you, hey, you better be afraid. So did I tell you this story? I was in Houston, went down and went to go for a run one night after midnight, and the guy at the front desk said, hey, this is a dangerous neighborhood. And my quick answer was, I'm from Chicago. I said, oh, all right, go on. Okay, so if we got the ballad of the bullet, that's fine. That gives us a little more drill her out. Okay, the any follow-up themes that we want to connect with this? One which I'll mention as well nearby is one of our very talented students, Mary Patillo. She got a job. She spent most of her career at Northwestern, but she still lives like me in Bronzeville. There are only about two or three sociologists who that seems to have, I won't say ever, but to my knowledge, ever lived in Bronzeville and participated. I mean, been active in civic meetings, worked with the aldermen, worked with the neighborhoods, and so forth. And she and I have both done that. We've gone to a number of meetings together, and her book on Bronzeville is useful in that sense. She then went one step further, and she has a paper here co-authored with Marcus Anthony Hunter, Zandria Robinson, Kanea Yamata Taylor, and the title is Black Placemaking, Celebration, Play, and Poetry. She also is a student so Forrest was not a student, although he was heavily influenced by him. He read the work of William Julius Wilson. Mary Patillo, I worked actively with Bill when Bill was here for years. Mary, as did several of his students, began to say, there are more things going on than is right there in the simple interpretation of Bill Wilson's books. And so this paper goes further, that she learned when she was a student. But in fact, Bill Wilson himself, when he wrote the book, and let me add a new point I didn't mention. When Bill Wilson then wrote the book about adding culture, what was his sources? His most important sources were his own students who had done these things and had done usually ethnographic fieldwork, including Mary Patillo, including 4 or 5 others who walked around the streets of Philadelphia or Chicago or Cambridge or other places, and they'd come up with new kinds of things, illustrating not just the crude, simple material, money, land, whatever, but that you also had celebration, play, and poetry. Hey! So what she does, what they do, is to write about different kinds of activities. And so what they did, and I have one more illustration, which if we scroll down here, let me finish a little more, then we'll follow. What they do, and what I'll mention, which we'll look in a second, is the perspective is to say, what is there which engages low-income African American, and especially men? Not just the ballad of the bullet, not just being tough with a picture of a gun, but also doing different things. And the answer is, and so they have going to nightclubs, listening to rap and writing poetry. Rap is poetry. Play, different ways of using social media. That is exploring a range of playful kinds of the old economic term could be leisure time or leisure activities, which is what you may find in the census or in official ways of listing these things, rather than just calling it leisure time, or as they call it in Oxford. Oxford, they're starting to move with studies of time to include some of this stuff, but with Here we got black placemaking. Placemaking, this gives it an urban scenes, neighborhood meaningfulness. This redefines Bronzeville. Bronzeville is not just crime, bad things, broken windows. It's a place of play, celebration, and poetry. When I talk to my neighbors who have black faces who lived there for a number of years, someone says, "Is this a bad place, or is this a dangerous place, or is this a wrong kind of place, or a poverty place?" No, we're not a bad place. It's a great place to live. The same thing is true in almost all the neighborhoods in Chicago. I've had students who both lived in Bronzeville and lived in there are one or two areas with higher crime rates and higher problems around the city. And they still say the same thing. Okay. It tends to be the perspective of outside middle class, let's say, using that loose, broad, culturally defined term. Have I mentioned this explicitly? Maybe let me do so if I don't hear. That is, the reason I ask is we had almost a decade of papers, presentations on class conflict, which is the Marxist label of the driver of history, long term. Okay, class conflict, what's class? And I gave you an example of cigarette smokers can be a class. And this is one example which came which is used in some discussions here, even in general education here. But if you will, the more European socialist and more literally Marxist tradition would be more material and focused on, Marxist term would be access to the means of production, like capitalist, having more capital or more of a factory and able to have more impact, therefore, on other things. If instead we ask ourselves, how does this change when we have things like the ballad of the bullet? Access to the means of production, symbolism, how do these work? If you look at the sort of the foundational publications, I mentioned, I'll build up from a Bronzeville example to illustrate the more general point. Several of the neighborhood leaders in Bronzeville, if you ask them, who do you really hate? Do they say the gangs? No, they say the University of Chicago. The most oppressive institution around us is the biggest employer, at least it used to be the biggest employer in the city of Chicago, with the biggest police department. The university's police, so we have to protect these people around. Okay, so when the vice president, when we did the bike rides together for a while, one of the guys we rode with was the vice president for community affairs of the University of Chicago, and he was the director of the University of Chicago Police. So in conjunction with them, they said, you want to have some University of Chicago police, we could also protect the Bronzeville area if you want to have some University of Chicago police, to have more police come around your way. Yes, that would really we'd really like to have that. And then I started inviting some of these some of these folks to come to my classes. So what's it like in different Bronzeville, etc. And one would say, well, we hate everything to do with the university, but there's one good thing that the really best thing that you did was a book called Black Metropolis. This was published in the 40s but it grew out of the field work by the head of the sociology department for a couple of years, and who had come here from Harvard, and he was trained as an anthropologist. And he came up with a different perspective of thinking about these things than the normal old Chicago tradition. And so I mentioned Edward Shills, who'd been with Tonka Parsons, had gone to Heidelberg. Edward Shills had gone to the poor boy. He went to the public libraries, or the University of Pennsylvania library, and he read about Max Weber. So they said, hey, we got new things here. And they began to say, we don't just have material driver, we have culture can go the other way, and things can be interrelated. So Weber avoided causal arrows. He talked about interrelationships much more. He had a couple of different terms for it. The background, senior author of Yankee City, was the work he'd done nearby Harvard. And it studied not black, poor neighborhood. It was an old, elite, traditional white Anglo-Saxon neighborhood. And it was termed Yankee City to try to say, what makes this place different? And they had such things as a celebration of the oldest families, which would not just didn't just have a materialist interpretation. You had to be rich. Rich, if you were just rich and you were, say, president of the bank and you came from Texas or whatever, and you were in this little town, were you part of the upper class? No, because you only had money. And so what he found in the minds of the people there, and they began to look at where and how they differentiated the different residents, he found we don't have two classes of capitalists and proletarians, we have six. There's six conceptually distinct ways of classifying from high to low. And he called them upper, middle, and lower, and then upper, middle, upper, middle, and then so six types. And the difference between the lower upper would be the banker who had a lot of money, but he did not have long family connections to the history of the town. And so how were these made explicit in kinds of activities that we could see as buzz, celebration, activism in an urban area? Well, they had, how do you celebrate the past? The 4th of July is is like the Chinese version of the Spring Festival. And they have a parade the way you do in China. But in the parade, what they would do in Yankee City was to have a reenactment by people dress up like soldiers and said, we're fighting the British. We are creating, the United States will be an independent post-colonial society. We're breaking away from colonialism. We don't want to be the British, so we will create a new society. And that happened on July 4th. Okay, so the July 4th parade still happens. It's not necessarily, most places just have fireworks. You have fireworks, fine. But to have the old family members dressed up, that is some persons who were actual family members, they put on, maybe not, that at least updated versions, which look as if they were the 4th of July. And they show in that way through the streets that these families fought the British, and they had that kind of aristocratic linkage. That is, the classic aristocratic class activity was violence and war. That is, what made the aristocracy a legitimate leader in Germany, France, and England? It wasn't being rich. They fought. And so in those days, there was a meritocratic foundation, if you will, for being an aristocrat. Okay, so in a sense, the Yankee City culture, there's a whole volume. There are 5 volumes of this book. The last volume is on the culture of Yankee City. And this is an illustration that I'm giving you of how this was done. Follow-up, linking this to Chicago again, not only did the senior author come here, but so did some other anthropologists 20, 30, 40 years later, in the 1960s, I think it was, 50s, 60s, 70s. They did a follow-up, and what happened to that parade from the 1930s? After the counterculture, after 68, and so forth. It was led not by an old family member. The organizer, the official organizer, was a Quebecois. That is, the Quebecois was sort of the lowest of the classes, ethnic classes of the time. That is, French-speaking Canadians who came there to do menial jobs and to then gradually rise. And so he then was sufficiently visible, or whatever. He was considered appropriate to lead the parade, or some of the old family members that either died off or they didn't care about it. But then also included in the parade were things like McDonald's people and McDonald's clowns. We had some gays. We had all kinds of things in the parade which were closer to the gay parade. All kinds of changes which came in through the 1960s with the counterculture were now in the parade. Okay, so this gives you a tangible example of urban activities and placemaking, black placemaking in the title from Mary Patillo and co-authors, with play and poetry in ways that drastically change from the old linkages to the class, but the conceptual, we're now playing conceptual. Where do these concepts come into our readings about it? And I mentioned the classic Marxist definition. I mentioned that Marty Lipset and I put on about 10 years of meetings because we published a paper called Our Social Class is Dying. And we exaggerated a little bit with the title, but the general point was we're getting a transformation of the meaning of class. And so we published a book called The Breakdown of Class Politics. And so at least if you look at the class politics of this gets redefined, and one which redefined was redefined was what is class? Okay, so the example that came from the Yankee City, I mentioned the 6 types, and I give you the example of the banker would have a lot of money, but he could never be upper because he couldn't march in the parade the way you had to do it in the 1930s. Okay, even though he had a sports car, he was a Harvard graduate and so forth, but he wasn't from the local town. Okay, so the many others writing about social stratification. When I came here in the late 60s, there were 5 courses called social stratification. So I'd been teaching that before. I wanted to teach it as well. There were 4 other people teaching, all had the same title, social stratification. This is my course, so we all. But then, so I talked to how do you do this? Can I see your reading list? What do you read and so forth? So then the question was, and then similarly, it's not just this one department. This was true of sociologists, and today we still have a fair amount of discussion of social stratification, and linked, but it's more often linked to diversity now in terms of the hotter, more current labels. But the point which these bring out is that you can redefine class in terms of the cultural underpinnings of the society and the subgroup, as I'm illustrating with Yankee City or with Chicago and with Bronzeville. More abstractly, those 6 classes were defined by people at Oxford and Paris and so forth as American class structures. But the key point was it was not defined by access to physical material. These were culturally defined. That is, the classes were defined by culture and lifestyle. He was an anthropologist in training. Maybe that connected in another more explicit way, that kind of conceptual linkage. But it's the interpenetration of these things which are now being featured in Freakonomics and in other kinds of economic analyses, which are simply more holistic and bring these pieces together. As we then say, switch, for example, to China, what are the classes which are used in China today, or let's say 20, 30 years ago, if you took a course on social stratification? Is that too tough a question? I mean, I've looked into this and I've read and asked this many times. That is, I've consciously had Chinese teaching assistants for decades. Any sense?
Yeah, I'm not very familiar with like sociology course in China.
Okay, fine. So many Chinese Chinese say the same thing. So if you look, and I was surprised to learn this myself. I didn't know the answer to this. And so if you look back to the more classic, Marx is the key theorist for class in the past in China and in Germany and elsewhere. Access to means of production, and the two classes, let's say in industrial society, were the capitalists and the proletarians. Class conflict. Okay, if you read today, more recently in China, the concept which is used, the main term is in China. What's the main class in China today? Middle class. What's that mean in China? Same thing as Yankee City. It's culturally defined. It's lifestyle. It is not simple access to them in the Marxist term. So the Chinese social stratification textbooks, journal articles, courses on social stratification in some people would say, a communist society, is not traditional Marxism. It is modern. It's the kind of post-industrial Marxism which you have in Sharon Zukin, or students of Bill Wilson, Ballad of the Book, or Ballad of the Ballad, Mary Patilla. That is, people who came from that background are changing. And why are they doing it? Because life is changing. People are changing. That is you in ways that I won't say we should. That is the reason that I made the lecture in a sense a session or two back. We can't forget Marx. Marx is still critically to understand the foundational backgrounds of lots of concepts we use, but where and how they got changed. So you can either say, what the French Communist Party said was, Lenin, Marx and Lenin, this is all we do. If French society changes, the hell with it. All we care about is the party position. By contrast, the Spanish, the Italians, the others said, hey, you're wrong. We have the environment. We have human rights. These are big issues. We should pay attention. Euro-communism, we're going to do this. So they did this for maybe 15, 20 years before 1989. Okay, so the French never changed. The French Communist Party never changed until the Berlin Wall went down. Okay, so the point is then, culture is now rising in the minds and the activities of people when they're in the parade of that, even in that same physical place, that little town north of Cambridge called Yankee City. but it also, at least, is the way that people who are doing what they call original field work, and I mentioned the Sharon Zook and Philip Kasnitz, they're global cities, local streets. That is, I would say the way I mean, why are they doing that book with that title? To say, life is more global. We are indeed more cosmopolitan with global people, both local examples, whether it's wedding dresses or celebrations or poetry. We're finding these kinds of things all around the world. The most popular film in Sweden, is that the most popular audience? And would you think the great Swedish film director Bergman would be the most widely viewed and thought of as a top film by the Swedes? No. What's the most visibly and frequently read and cited film in Sweden? It's an American film about the Civil War. Okay. Okay. The point is, these new kinds of things come in and spread globally, but is it due simply to the material, or is it because they watch social media or they watch movies? And all of these are interpenetrating. When I was teaching in Paris, a woman came up to me and said, I'd like to do an MA thesis on the American city. I said, really? Okay, what do you have in mind by that? You know, the American city. I said, but what's the American city? Well, you know, there's the sheriff, there's the outlaw, there's the banker, and the sheriff fights with the outlaw, and they kill the outlaw, and the good guys win. That's the American city. She wanted to do her French MA thesis on the American city. What was its source? Movies! Movies! Okay, so Hollywood spreads the word. Bollywood, Hollywood, etc. Is this wrong? Well, no. It's a culturally defined vision. We should look at the movie. If people watch and think and talk about it, it's real. It's real in their heads. Okay. And people talk about the ballad of the bullet, or the placemaking gets redefined in new ways. Okay. And I'm using some dramatic. Maybe you're saying, "Oh, this is errors." You know, exaggerate. That is, you can learn from looking at regression lines and the points on the regression line, but you can also learn interesting things by taking deviant cases way off that regression line and say, why are they so different? Including the Ballad of the Bullet, or the woman who was doing or Manuel Castells, the author of the major French language, and then became translated into English, very popular Marxist urban book in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And then when his Euro-Communist Party, as he was Spanish, said, you know, we're now doing Euro-Communism, he then started to talk about new social movements, and the environmental movement was an important thing to pay attention to. And the French said, no, you can't talk about environment. That's not what the Communist Party in France will talk about. And so you have a battle. I talked about Henri Lefebvre, my first course in sociology. Henri Lefebvre, I mean, he was and is, and today in Americans, among certain sociologists who still say, we still need a Marxist sociology of urban analysis, and Henri Lefebvre is the specificity of the city. This is a classic today. Okay, so I'm pointing these out. You need to understand where and why these people are saying these things that sound distinctive, let's say. You see. China, in that sense, is a powerful case because of some of the points that I raised about the changes in middle class, the changes in stratification. How are people high and low in China? Do you measure it? Should we measure it by income? Should we measure in income differences? And so among the whole world, the biggest income differences are probably, I think were in the Middle East, where you have these big, huge, very affluent traditional families in Saudi Arabia, some of those countries. But if you go to Western Europe and the U.S., the more economically developed countries of the world, the U.S. it's a very small number of people, and we sometimes will show a section here. The Wall Street occupied. It happened in nearby Wall Street. There were young people who said, we want to occupy Wall Street. We want to make this into part of it. We want to make a new social movement and occupy Wall Street. And they did. And it blocked some, and so the police, others got upset for a while and so forth. But they stayed on for a couple of, I'm not forgetting how long it was, 2 weeks, something like that. Finally, they got pushed out. But they made a dramatic kind of new social movement activity attacking Wall Street, and some things which were put out in press releases and so forth, that something like the top 1% of Americans own roughly half or more than half of all the money in the U.S. So the top 1% is clearly elitist in terms of a material measure, according to at least tax returns and so forth. But if you then ask Americans, are you part, if you take a national sample of Americans, are you part of the upper class, upper lower, upper middle, lower middle, upper lower, lower lower? Most people say, no, I'm middle class. You do the same thing in China? No, I'm not part of upper in China. I'm not a central committee of the Communist Party. I'm just an average middle class Chinese. What does that say? I'll leave it to you. Okay. We got any discussion? I'm deliberately moving a little bit in the Chinese direction. Let me say, for my teaching it, but the reason I'm also for you students who are not from China, I'm saying you can learn more about yourselves as an American elitist society with the most money that way by a smaller elite. But if they think of themselves as middle class, what does that mean? And does it and that is when that small elite at the time, around 1890, 1900, as I mentioned, people like Mellon, Ford, Rockefeller, when those people became very affluent from the railroads and gas and so forth, oil, and they said, well, we'll do what the European elites do. We'll build some castles. And I mentioned to you briefly. What happened? People said, we're going to create an income tax, so we will tax if you do that kind of work. If you have all that money, let's create an income tax to take it away from those very rich people. And Teddy Roosevelt was elected president of the United States, and he came from an old elitist family background, but he was implementing policies illustrating what we talk about in the community power section. It's not just who's the best, so your social background or your income or your education or your gender or whatever defines what you do. You've got to look separately. Look at what people actually say and do, such as I'm middle class. And Roosevelt created, for example, the national park system. So we had parks, and so we had nice views, and people could buy the land, they could put up a house anywhere they wanted. So he said, stop. Let's preserve these beautiful areas of the U.S. from the Rocky Mountains to parts of Florida and Massachusetts. Let's make these national parks so that they're beautiful for the indefinite future. The Chinese have now created, they've gone a step further, which is even more interesting. They're called cultural parks, Chinese national cultural parks. But they're not just views of the beach and the mountains. They include Shanghai. They include your city of Wuhan. The big cities are also part of national parks, but they then set them up, and what the government has, this is new in the last 10 years or so. So they've created national parks which can try to attract, again, like people, the biggest industry in the either first or third largest industry in the world is tourism. Chinese get vacations, and they drive around in China. Some of them will go to Paris and buy handbags, etc. But a lot of them will drive around nearby, and they go to Chinese cultural parks. Why is this important and interesting for the Chinese and for the leadership? Because they tell the story of, especially the post-Mao version of Chinese history, a little bit, it's not heavily propagandistic, but it's a distinctive kind of orientation. And in Moscow, they're doing something similar to this, having a sort of a national park, trying to have all the different regions of the Soviet Union, and spreading all around. And probably, yeah, I don't know where and how the Ukraine is featured in that Moscow park. Good thing to look up if you want for a short memo for this course. Okay. National cultural parks. They've also given a lot of money, and I've learned about this because the government has funded evaluations of these national cultural parks, and people have collected data. They've got interviews. They've got things like Yelp, the Chinese version of Yelp. They have people saying, what's the most wonderful, interesting things that people say about the National Cultural Park? Well, why did you come here? What did you most appreciate? Number one was the ethnic groups. Separate, is that a Marxist category? No. The ethnic groups, which may be multiple, I won't try to choose or label any, but that is the same thing with the Chinese restaurants. There are about 100 different types of Chinese regional food and regional restaurants, which most people in the West don't know about. They may know a little bit about Cantonese or Shanghai or something like that, but within China, there are ethnic specificities for food and for ethnic culture, for dancing, for music, and this is one of the things which attracts the Chinese to see and learn more about this, to learn about the history, and they're building thousands of new museums across China, and they put things like this in it. So the first two things are the music, the dancing, and so forth, associated with the parks, but also as I mentioned, what are the things that you most appreciate in the National Cultural Park? Culture, ethnic culture, ethnic dance, and number 3 is bars. Okay, Teddy Roosevelt may not have appreciated having national parks have the third most appreciated being bars, but that's because the Chinese are sophisticated and subtle enough not to include just the mountains, but to also include Shanghai and Wuhan, the whole city. This is part of Chinese life. And so in that sense, to think about Shanghai can be a cultural institution, a cultural creation. And people can come there as visitors who do not live in Shanghai. They live in the countryside. Well, let's go see what it's like. And so the Yangtze River Cultural Park goes through Shanghai, and there's a lot of work trying to look at how this attracts people and what difference it makes. Okay, so the general point I'm illustrating with these examples are things that are happening also in China, also in the US, also in Western Europe, even if their broader historical, philosophical backgrounds may be very different. Not to say that they're homogeneous everywhere. Clearly the background histories are always will be there. But that is celebrated in the cultural part. Just one more point. Before they began the cultural parks, the Chinese would use the term simple park, and I thought of a place with grass and mountains and nature and so forth. Isn't that a park? Oh no, a park can also be a building in a big city in Shanghai. And so people can go to that, and that building could have people who are painting paintings. They may be making cultural activities, rehearsing music. They may be doing a variety of things which would be similar to the Logan Center on campus, where students are doing these kinds of, they may have stand-up comedy. They may have a new version of Shakespeare or something like that. The Chinese do that, and they call it a park. Okay, the different meanings of these two different institutions, the more traditional park, which can, and so in a sense somehow, I don't know why, that is the idea that a park includes cities and is not just a rural area, in ways that I will leave. Well, I do know a little about the answer, but I won't say anything for now. And we will end for now. We will have our session, next week is Thanksgiving week. Celebrate. The 10th week of class, the first Monday, we will have a review of the course, cover anything. I'm sorry, we'll have a little bit of these things. Anything that would be useful, including a little bit perhaps from your Chinese team working on dynamics of cities, and that would be fine if that works for you then. And then no. I'm sorry. We've got Monday. So Monday I guess is for the arts. It's supposed to be the arts and related issues. Yeah. Wednesday is the review. Isn't that right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. The last class of the last week of class is the 10th week, and so Monday on this is more. And so as you see, we're redefining it in ways that will fit with whatever. If there are people who want to. If we have more students, and we have some students who are thinking about or talking about any kind of paper, your version of paper is fine, and I sent out that how can you improve your grade, do a little more work. And we've got 2 weeks. If you want to raise your grade, do some more work. Make a video, write a poem, something else. Write a poem that includes some social science and some modeling. Okay. And make it for an economics course as well. Okay. We'll end it there. We'll have 2 more sessions after Thanksgiving. Have a pleasant time. And if you want to bring back some examples of things, try some of this out with your family members, and let's discuss it from how to celebrate Thanksgiving and we'll go on from there. Okay. Thank you, folks.